Start work for today. This is the last day in our conference. At the beginning, the paper will be present by, the first one is the COVID-19 and bank branch lending, the moderate effect of digitalization. Benjamin Tabak from the FGV NPPG, yes? Could be. You present the paper. The floor is yours. In the beginning, please. The rule for this session is the president has 20 minutes to present the paper. The discussion, 8 minutes to present the considerations. After that, before that, I open the floor to any questions. And at the end, the president make comments. Okay? Go on.
Okay. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present this paper here. This is joint work with Tiago, Sergio, and Solange. Tiago, Sergio, and Solange, you can raise your hands, please. They're over there. Okay, so any questions, you can be free to ask them. As usual, the usual disclaimer applies, so any comments and any opinions are ours, our own, and not necessarily those of the central bank. Myself and Tiago, we gratefully acknowledge financial support from CNPq Foundation. I think the first motivation of the paper is to understand the role of digitalization, which is something that has been going on even before the COVID-19 crisis, and how does it affect the credit market? So what we do is that we study, basically we compare banks that have more digitalization with banks less digitalized and show the effects in terms of credit markets on these banks. The motivation is that the COVID, we have other papers which show that the COVID has had a major impact on financial markets, especially on the banking side. And I think we have one of these papers, we show that the impact is even greater than the one in the global financial crisis in 2008. And then you ask yourself, well, why haven't we seen all these failures as we saw in 2008, 2009? Well, because most governments around the world entered the market and they intervened, and they made substantial interventions across the globe. So the COVID-19 pandemic affected the global economy, has a big impact on the economy, and it played an important role in shaping the financial environment, specifically in the first year of the pandemic. We also have some heterogeneous effects because several banks were also already in the verge of digitalizing themselves, and we have some heterogeneous distribution of these technologies. So what we see is that we have banks with more technological resources, and they have some advantages in the financial market because they can close branches, they can borrow, they can even screen their borrowers more effectively, even if the borrowers are far away from these branches. Banks with low level of technology rely more on soft information. And what we see is that you have a lot of discussion whether digitalization of the banking system, what is the effect of this digitalization on the credit market? But we also discussed this effect on financial stability, and it's something that we have some gaps on the literature. First, we have mostly two effects that they can counterbalance themselves. First, IT may allow banks to be less sensitive to local borrowers' condition. So when you think about the crisis in 2008, several banks that were reliant on local borrowers failed because they couldn't adjust themselves accordingly after the crisis. So right now, if you have more investment in information technology, then you can lend remotely, and then you can have this advantage compared to other banks. But some banks are over-reliant on information technology. And because of that, they're likely to overemphasize what we call hard information. But in times of crisis, soft information is very essential. So you have two results that you can end up with depending on the conditions in the financial system. So this can undermine, this this last point can undermine financial stability because it's so critical in times of distress. When you look at the literature, most of the literature looks at loan growth as a measure for bank, what we call willingness to supply loans. They look at bank level. They perform the analysis at the country level. They investigate the effects of changes on interest rates and role of capitalization, and they study the impact of information technology on banks' performance and adjusting in credit supply. But this is all what we call some aggregate measures at the more refined granularity is at the bank level. So this paper adds to the literature because we are looking at more recent loan issuances during the COVID, but we're looking not only at the bank branches, but also at the credit type level. So we use data at the branch. We understand how local COVID affect bank branches, bank lend behavior in the first year of the pandemic. So this is a short-term effect during the pandemic and the beginning of the pandemic. And it helps understanding the role of IT in bank lending behavior. So the moderator effect of the bank lending performance. So the research question is, how did COVID-19 change bank lending behavior during the first year of the pandemic? Did digitalization moderate the impact of COVID-19 on banks? We have two claims that first, the financial systems were already undergoing a heavy process of digitalization, and also the Federation of Banks in Brazil were claiming that banks in Brazil were already in 2019 investing heavily in digitalization. So the question is, the changes in lending behavior were affected by digitalization, but also these changes in lending behavior has any impact on financial stability and how digitalization moderates this effect. Now, we have several challenges in order to construct a model that helps us identify these effects. So our empirical strategy exploits the different timing and severity of COVID-19 across Brazilian localities. So Brazil is a very large country with continental dimensions, and the COVID were spread around the country with very different measures. But this is interesting because we have a very large country with a lot of heterogeneity. So we can understand how this heterogeneity may play a role in our results. And similarly, what we find is that most of the measures that were taken were done by the federal government, and they were all the same for all the country. So we have some sort of effects to combat the COVID-19, but they were all the same to the country. Now we have several challenges. The first one is the lack of data at the branch level. If you do some research and go for papers that use bank branch data, they are all scarce. They're really, really scarce. Even when we talk about measuring efficiency at the bank level, or most people do it at the bank level, not at the branch level. That would be the most important thing to do. So we have a second challenge, which is we have many simultaneous confounders. So we have to, for example, we have government programs that were employed to combat COVID that may confound our results. Now the data come from many, many different sources. We have bank and identified credit operation. This is proprietary data. 3 of them comes from the central bank, 1 from the Brazilian IRS. And we have ESTBAN, which is a public data set. We also have data for geographical location. This is defined by BGE, so we use all this definition. We have labor information from Raiz-Caged, and we have this information of COVID-19, which is the epidemiological bulletins and emergency aid beneficiaries. Because during the crisis, we had around 20 million people that were living from what we call the Bolsa Família program. We had some discussion, I believe, yesterday on that. And these people are around 20 million from some part. They discovered that there were many more that needed financial assistance during the COVID because in some cases they have some restrictions. And at the end, we have like 60 million people that received these emergency aid beneficiaries. So we'd like to take that into account. Now, our point is, we have some relevant background. We have a credit market, and we are looking at bank branch operating in a specific locality, and is granting a specific credit type. We have locality, which is defined by BGE. We think about the locality in terms of the bank granting credit borrowers. They can be anywhere. So it's where the bank granting credit. This is what we call the locality. And the bank branch, we aggregate all branches of a specific bank operating in a specific locality to form what we call this aggregate branch of the bank. And the credit type is credit modalities to individuals and non-financial firms. Now, this is one of the first issues, methodological issues, is how can we have a lot of very good quality on aggregate data at the funding for, and let's say, all the expenses for the bank at the aggregate level. How can we disentangle that for bank branches? So what we do is that we have a lot of information. We have very, very good quality information for at least 2/3 of these expenses at the branch level. And the rest, we use some assumptions to end up with what we call this distribution. So we can distribute the total cost by funding, tax, labor, and other expenses for each branch for that bank, for that particular bank. What we have, we are going to look at the impact of this COVID-19, the impact of on the bank, on the lending and the prices, but we also would like to look at total cost and what we call marginal costs and the prices in the market. So what we need is to calculate a translog cost function. And to do that, we need inputs, outputs, and a production function in which we call the bank, the locality, and time. I think the first thing to look at is that when you look at the geographical distribution pre and during the pandemic, we look at the effective prices and marginal cost. This is the distribution across Brazil. Here we have the percentages. And what we see is that in 2020, this changes dramatically, and it also an heterogeneous change. It didn't change the same overall. What we need now is some sort of measure for what we call a COVID-19 intensity, because we want to compare lending for the same bank for different branches, but one branch in a place that has a high COVID intensity and another branch is in a locality with a low COVID intensity. Now, mobility will be, let's say, a natural measure, but the problem with mobility is that you only have for capitals. It's not for all the municipalities. So what we do is that we look at the proxy, a number of COVID-19 cases as a share of the locality's population. So the higher the COVID-19 prevalence, the higher the probability of lockdowns, the low person-to-person contact, it reduces economic activity, the higher the number of health permits, the higher remote work, the higher the use of digital services, and so on. So what we do is that we use this proxy. This is a proxy for the COVID-19 intensity. Now let's look at our exogenous variation, which is the COVID-19, how it affects locality different. What we find is that when we look at May 13, 2020, August, and December, again, we see a strong heterogeneity in the impact of COVID across Brazil. Now, one of the issues is that, okay, we want to include this COVID-19 prevalence as a variable to control in all our regressions, but what if the specific macro variables for the regions, for the regional level, at the municipality level, are correlated with our measure of the COVID-19 prevalence? So what we do is that we run the COVID-19 intensity as a dependent variable with all these municipality level observables, and we control for several fixed effects. When we don't control, we see that there's a lot of correlation. When we control for region fixed effects, state, macro locality, and per capita GDP. When we control for this fixed effect, we don't have correlation between our measure and municipality bank level. So what we do is that we use this in the model. So what we're doing, our empirical setup, is that we view COVID-19 as a local demand shock. We control for macro locality and similar wealth. This is the GDP. And when we look at the Bank B, we are comparing Bank B, the branch of Bank B, at locality 8 and locality B. One with higher COVID-19 intensity and the other with low COVID intensity. We all compare across localities, but we also compare for specific credit types. Now, we have several challenges because we have many simultaneous confounders. When we think about households, we have direct cash transfers. This was a big issue during the COVID-19 crisis. We have a lot of emergency aid. So what we do is that we control for emergency aid volume over GDP in each location. We also had some support for small and medium enterprises. So we also control for the number of SMEs in each location as a percentage of the total numbers of firms in the locality. And when we think about banks, we also had some changes in regulatory framework to foster credit issuances, such as reduction in reserve requirements. So we have some heterogeneity when we think about the regulatory framework. So what we do is that we compare branches of the same bank to cope with that. So we have a within bank approach. We also have some different macro policies. Again, this is no problem in a difference in diffuse analysis, so we don't need to control for that. Now, the first result is that the COVID-19 intensity, it does not change effective price. So what we do here is that we regress the post-COVID-19 intensity on credit income, granted credit, and effective prices. Now, it doesn't affect effective prices, but it affects negatively the credit income and also the credit, the granted credit. So our bottom line is that the decrease in credit income is offset by a similar decrease in credit issues. And we also find an increase in what we call marginal cost using the translog function and the derivative of the translog function that we just see. Our findings suggest that marginal cost increase 0.5 cents for a 1 standard deviation increase in the COVID-19 prevalence. So this is economically relevant because the sample mean is 4 cents. Now, when we think about the cost factors, it is reasonable to assume that in the short term, cost factors are sticky. So our main finding is that IT provides what we call cost flexibility. We find that in this case, when we look at the cost factor, we include the COVID-19 and the cost factor. We look at funding, tax, labor, other administrative expenses, and IT. IT is the only one that is significant, and it reduces total cost. So it helps banks achieve a more flexible cost structure. Okay, we have cost flexibility, but through which cost factor does digitalization provide cost flexibility? We find that is through funding. So what we're thinking is funding costs. This is the one that is negative, and it's way negative. And we look at labor costs, they are positive. So you have a positive shock on labor costs, but again, you find that funding costs are the main, they dominate this increase. We also look at the differential effects on bank deposits and branches. And what we find here is that when you look at the post-COVID-19 IT costs, what we're seeing here is that more digitalized banks experience what we call increased deposits. So, and it's going through individuals, okay, not firms. Firms is not significant. So what we're seeing here is that this may rationalize the decrease in funding costs. More digitalized banks increase labor costs, labor force, but because when you look at the branch labor force, when you look at employees, the number of employees and the payroll is significant on the payroll. So you see an increase in labor force, probably because you are swapping people from for example, to work with IT within the bank doing that. We also look at the benefit of IT in terms of cost flexibility. When we look at the differential effects on branches' asset structure, what we see is that banks that invest more in IT, they reallocate their assets going to other assets, but banks that do not have an intense, are not low in digitalization, they reallocate their assets to interbank assets. So it seems that they don't have good borrowers, so they're going to the interbank market. We look at other benefits of IT. Flexibility, you have credit outside locality, clients outside locality. And the IT, when we look at how digitalized banks are, it has a positive effect on both. So bank branches concentrate lending locally for more affected localities. However, IT enable banks to increase lending away. The net effect, more digitalized banks improve their positioning in the credit market. So this is the net effect. We have a decrease in marginal cost, increase in credit income, granted credit, decrease in marginal cost, and again, this is mostly a robustness test. We also look at, well, let's look at the crisis in 2009. Let's look at the period before. We don't have pre-trends. We only have that low digitalization banks. They have they have their marginal costs affected. When we look at the more digitalized banks, they are not affected during the crisis. So marginal costs are virtually unaffected. There are more benefits of IT because this is one of the questions. Lending flexibility favors financial stability in our case. Mostly when you look at this, the provision outside credit, it's significant, but it's negative. So more digitalized banks can mitigate this increase in credit provision, because they're just able to access more distant location with less risky borrower. We perform many robustness tests, and we conclude branches in localities are more affected by COVID. They reduce the lending and receive less credit income relative to branches in less affected area. The effective prices, no significant changes. What we find is that branches cannot quickly adjust their local costs in response to the relative drop in what we call credit issues, leading to an increase in marginal cost. However, when we look at more digitalized banks, they enjoy higher cost flexibility and lending flexibility. This lending flexibility from IT favors financial stability in our case. So what we find is that more digitalized banks enjoy a competitive advantage in types of credit requiring more sophisticated online banking system. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Bernardo Rica from INSPER to discuss the paper. O computador não.
Tá ali, deixa ele.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm going to discuss this paper. So first, I want to thank the authors because I know the paper has been accepted and a journal, so congratulations. So given that, I'm going to give like a more broad discussion about the topic in general. So start with a brief summary. The question is, how did COVID change banks' lending behavior? And in particular, how did IT investments moderate those effects? And I think what I think is the main find is that banks that invested more in IT, they fared better during the pandemic, right? And channels that the authors propose, they have more flexibility to adjust costs. They can expand to less affected regions. They don't need to be closer to be very close to their borrowers. They can lend to distant borrowers and so on. So this is a very relevant finding. So that's great, I think. So there's talks to the implications of the digitalization process in the banking industry, like it enhances resilience of banks. It makes banks less exposed to local shocks. And as a consequence, it increases financial stability, right? So I reading the paper, I think it resembles the venting out story that people have found in trade, for example. So that's also, I think, good. In that, when there is a local shock, firms start to vent out to foreign markets, and the mechanism is similar. It's the drop in marginal costs. So I think I may invite the authors to take a look at the trade literature, because I think there are some very strong similarities, which is good. So there's a good side of digitalization, but since the recent crisis in the US, we know that there is a dark side as well. So, for example, what Rajan, what Zingale is now, and co-authors, Kunt and Santos, called digital bank walks, right? For example, that digital banks make deposits less sticky, right? So we have to think about other. It's good that they enhance financial stability in one direction, but they might harm stability in other directions. For example, by reducing it's much easier to run on a digital bank, right? You can run. You don't have to rush to a branch, right? And queue up to you just go to your app and withdraw the resources, right? So there is, I think, which effects dominates, we need to think, depends on the type of crisis, etc. So yeah, so now I'm gonna give I guess smaller comments about the paper, and not only about the paper, but actually maybe trying to show my take in the literature in general and how we can improve, given that the paper has been accepted. So there's always, the authors do a great job at trying to address concerns that COVID is related to other variables that we cannot observe, but there is always a remaining concern that okay, given controlling for observables, COVID intensity looks random, but we still need to, I think about unobserved variables that we cannot test. So maybe think maybe the authors can do a triple diff. For example, looking at industries like tradables versus non-tradables in affected localities, right? Then you can sort of control for things that you're not observing that are happening in that locality, right? So that's something that I thought that could be a nice test. I think the other side also tried to make the point that seeing COVID as a demand shock for loans, right? But I was thinking that many other things happened. So this paper by Levine and showing that during COVID there was a large flight to deposits. So I have I put a picture that I took. It's not, but here in blue you see loans in the U.S. market. In orange you see deposits. So deposits really spiked during the COVID crisis, right? And this might not be heterogeneous across localities. Actually, the authors document some effects on growth in deposits. And if you think that there are synergies, right, for the economies of scope between deposits provision, payment and loans provision, this might, confound a bit the effects. I think it might actually help if you think about maybe these economies of scope or economies of scope, depending on the assumption. But I think it's maybe it would be good to have a discussion about these other things that are going on besides a demand shock for loans. The other thing that I'll think is that okay, so we are talking about IT, but banks that invest more in IT, they might be different in other dimensions. I know the authors are controlling for bank time fixed effects. They're looking a within bank comparison, but if these banks have different organizational structures, managerial practices, maybe they are better equipped to deal with crises, for example, with so maybe they fare better in more severely affected localities, but not because of IT, because they're better in other dimensions. So that's, I think I would like maybe to see a bit more discussion on that, in that as well. So it's not IT itself. Maybe these banks are better. They are better at managing crises, and but because they have a different organization structure here, I cited a paper talking about this. And also another thing is that these banks might cater to different industries, so specialization, etc. And then, the availability of granular data, you could do within industry comparison, add more controls to deal with this possibility of specialization. And the third thing about that is about, it's a very daunting task to make a cost function of banks, right? So this is a crucial input of the paper. So in general, I think IO economists have been thinking about this for a long time, and in banking, I think we need to maybe to think a little bit, because it's so important, right, to estimate marginal costs. But there is simultaneity problem, functional form, strong assumptions, etc. And one assumption, for example, in the paper is that banks' output is branch output is credit, but we know that many branches very grant credit, right? They just focus on issuing deposits, payments, providing other services. So it's very hard to think about production function, banking, etc. I mean, this is just more like a provocative slide in the sense that, okay, we need to think to make progress in the direction of, think about the production technology in banking and estimating marginal costs in a consistent manner, etc. But that's a great paper. I really enjoyed the reading, and again, congratulations for it's amazing work, super relevant, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss.
Thank you. Now, if everyone has some questions about the paper, please. Okay, turn on the button in front of you and make the question, please.
Hello, thank you. So my question is related to the discussion's point. I want to know what's the advantage to estimate at the branch level, because my understanding is IT investment decision is a bank level decision, and they probably, for some reason, they choose some branch to have more expenses on IT. So that's my question.
Okay, thank you. Marwan, here, please.
My question is about who are these digital banks, if they, for instance, cater lower income households or certain products, or are these more like the private banks, the foreign banks, to have a better idea who is the one leading the digitalization?
Thank you. Marwan? Okay, no. Tabak, please.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I think one of the issues that we aggregate everything at the branch level, and we're looking at the branch granting credit, the locality. We are not concerned with the borrower. I think that's another paper, because it's very hard to do that, mostly because firms or industries, when they borrow, they can have borrowing advantages. So maybe let's say the headquarters is the one that is asking for credit for another branch of the firm as well. And you need a lot of information on that. This information is a bit more complex to obtain, because since the data is based on the central bank, you have a lot of granularity and very detailed data at the branch level, at the bank level. But to have that at the borrowers, it's a really difficult task. I think it's an important task, but it's also a completely different issue. But I think it's an interesting new paper. I'm sorry, I didn't remember your question.
No, about who are the banks behind this measure of more IT? Private banks, banks specializing in catering lower income municipalities or households, or what type of credit are these banks giving?
Yes, it's mostly some big banks, some banks that are going digital. So we have a lot of heterogeneity in these banks. I'm not sure whether we have the list of the banks. Maybe we can add the list of the banks and which one enters, how these are distributed. Anyway, the proxy for digitalization is how much they have invested in IT. We have the national accounts, how much they invest in IT, and it's called Information Technology and Communications, how much they have invested in 2019. So we use that as a proxy for who's less and who's more digitalized. So we don't have, that's the idea, to have a more, let's say, exogenous variable for that.
No, it would be nice in the paper to have like a simple regression or table correlating who were the more digitalized with what type of business line these banks are, or what the size of these banks or something, to have a better idea of.
Yeah, when you look at what types of business the banks are, right? Okay, sure. Because this is also very complex when you look at the borrower, as he was saying in his discussion, because there are so many different ways of categorizing and classifying these industries, and you have to choose one. I saw one that has like 200, And you may end up with very, very sparse information, and it's very difficult to conclude anything when we look at the borrower side. We still need, I don't know, better information on the borrower side. Oh, just, and thank you, Bernardo, for your discussion. Very nice comments. We'll look into them. They're all very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for both. Now you go to the second paper from today. Now, the present is Bernardo Rica. The paper is Banks, Physical Footprint and Financial Technology Adaptation. Oh.
Hello. So, I'm going to present the paper Banks, Physical Footprint and Financial Technology Adoption. This joint work with José Renato here from the Central Bank, and Lucas from University of Milan Bicocca, and the usual disclaimers apply. Okay, so what's the context of our paper? So there's a recent expansion in new financial technologies worldwide. So, and in particular, digital payment methods, right? There is also the entry of these new players that we call them fintechs in general. So they're like us, and as many presenters mentioned, traditional financial service providers or traditional banks are also digitalizing, right? So they're also transitioning from like a branch-based model to a more increasingly digital business model, right? So as an example here, so just between 16 and 2021, Brazil lost, the number of branches in Brazil dropped by 20%, right? And this is very, this type of reduction is common worldwide in developed countries, etc. So what are we going to do in this paper? So given this reduction in the number of branches, we're going to try to study how brick and mortar branches, so traditional bank branches, moderate the diffusion of new payment technologies. And by influencing the diffusion of payment technology, they also might hinder the penetration of fintechs because they might increase the local dependence on cash. So I'm going to explain this a bit better. And we're going to investigate in detail a new payment technology called PIX. Now, everyone here knows that, and shed some light on its adopted determinants and impacts on competition. So how can PIX impact competition in the banking industry? So let's, I'm going to focus a bit more on this story today. So the link between branches and payment technologies. So as we know, a key function of branches is the provision of payment services. We usually think about banks like credit providers, but like a really key function is the provision of payment services. So they store and distribute currency, they issue them under deposits, etc. Right? And branches in particular might influence payment methods, in particular cash, because as you know, it's when there is a branch nearby, it's less costly to withdraw money, right? The transportation costs, etc. So branches, they lower the cost of handling cash, like withdrawing and deposit cash, right? So the thing is then is that physical branches, brick and mortar branches, might induce a locality to rely more on cash, and crucially, even on new potentially like welfare enhancing technologies become available, right? So this is a bit puzzling, but there is like a reason behind it, and that underlies this is that. So why is the diffusion of potentially better payment technologies hindered by a bank branch? Is because of main reason is coordination failures, right? So we know that payments, the benefit for an agent to use a payment technology depends on whether other agents accept technology. So the main example, for example, is cards, right? So I only have cards if shops accept cards, and the cards only accept cards if consumers use cards, right? So the synergies, adoption complementarities can lead to coordination failures and suboptimal adoption of technologies, right? There are other potential barriers to technology adoption in the literature, like learning costs, lack of information, organization constraints, etc. So again, by inducing cash, and the municipality might not adopt other technologies, right? Because of, for example, coordination failures. And then the link between cash usage and fintech penetration. So that's more straightforward. So digital institutions don't have the physical infrastructure to support cash withdrawals and deposits, maybe comparative advantage, large setup costs. So customers of fintech firms that need to use cash, they need to go to a traditional bank or at a cost, right? So as a result, this cash dependence can hinder the expansion of digital institutions, and therefore, like the availability of appropriate substitutes for cash, digital payment methods like PIX, right, can foster competition in payment markets, and crucially because there is, like, as we know, lots of complementarities between payments and credit, also in credit markets, right? Because as I know, once you start making payments through a bank, the bank has more information, the bank is more equipped to lend, right? So there's like lots of paper now documenting complementarities, synergies between payment and credit services. So the challenge of the paper is that, so we're going to look at changes in the branch network of banks, and we know that this is endogenous, for example. So when a bank might decide to close a branch, if the consumers in that location are going to adopt adopting more digital technologies, right? So there's a paper on that, for example. So banks might close branches in places where the population is adopting digital technologies, right? So we need to deal with that. So what we're going to do, we're going to use like this very unique thing that happens in Brazil, is that sometimes, like in a small municipality, the municipalities wake up without a branch. So because during the night, in the dead of night, like some criminals go using explosives and they basically destroy the branch to try to get the cash of that branch, right? So we're going to argue that this is a very good shock because these criminal activities are performed by the non-local criminals. So they are not necessarily correlated with local changes in criminality, right? And the other good thing is that, so this is like basically like an event study, right? So we have high frequency data, like weekly data, and we're gonna go a step further when you're gonna do like a matched control using difference and difference, right? So I'm gonna talk a bit more about this type of crime, right? So again, the result of this type of crime is that, again, as you're in a small municipality, and then we wake up, there is no more branch. The branch someone exploded the branch in the previous night. You cannot access cash, right? So what's going to happen? So what you're going to find, this temporary shock, right, is going to induce, first it's going to like make the availability of cash in that municipality drops dramatically, right? And then what you're going to see is that this is going to lead to persistent increases in the adoption of digital technology. So people start adopting technology, and then the branch reopens, but then they don't go back to cash, right? So that's also I mean, it's relatively common finding in the literature that these temporary shocks, perturbations can lead to persistent effects. Right? And then I think more interesting, you're going to go and look at spillovers to unaffect the banks, in particular digital institutions. So you're going to see that these institutions, more peaks are going to be performed through those digital institutions, right, that are not affected directly by the shock, right, because the shock is an explosion of branch, and these institutions don't have branch. Right, and because of complementarities between payments and credit, you're going to see an increase in credit as well. So let me skip the related literature in the interest of time. So a bit more of context. We all know that the Brazil has a concentrated banking industry, so there's large potential gains from increasing competition. And despite being like an emerging economy, I mean, as we probably realize it, I mean, digitalization is common, so you can pay by cards everywhere, but cash remains relevant, right? So that's and then in 2020, the central bank introduced a PIX. So just to like very briefly discussion. So it's available. It's an instant payment method available 24/7 to individuals, business, and governments. There's mandatory participation of large banks. It's interoperable. It's very simple, so you don't need a key to perform a transaction instead of lengthy accounting and details. It's cheap because it's free of charge to individuals, and you only need an account in a bank or payment institutions and internet connection. Right? So this has been a big success. So only 2021, 9.5 billion transactions. Just so, again, a bit more of context. This is more, it's more common in person-to-person transactions. Like person-to-business and business-to-business are increasing now, but still person-to-persons account for the majority of transactions. Just to have a data from this is a central bank report from 2021, 54% of the adult population made one transfer using PIX during the 2021, right? But 40% of the population in Brazil still do not use any electronic system to make payments, right? So there is a last mile to go here, right? So okay. So what's our shock to the availability of cash in a municipality? We're gonna look at these robberies with the use of explosives. So as I mentioned, you know, you're in a small municipality, you wake up, there is no more branch in that municipality. So what happened during the night, in the dead of night, some criminals went there, they exploded the branch to try to reach the vault of the branch and get the cash, right? So they go, they do that, and they flee that region straight away. So again, they go, they hit, and they run. They don't stay in that locality. So it's not a local crime. They go, hit, and harm. So this happens suddenly. It's not expected, right? So this is a very, very, very complex operation. It requires skilled personnel, careful planning, expensive equipment. So this is not performed by a local guy, a local criminal in that locality, right? It's a sophisticated thing, organized crime. They go, they hit, and they leave, right? So this is very important for us because, again, we're going to show this is not correlated with any changes in crime in that locality, right? And because of this sophistication, this is performed by few organizations that they are organized, and then they hit, municipalities across the country, right? So just to have an idea, this is just some numbers here showing that this is indeed a very expensive operation, around $8,000. So this is an example. So again, the municipality wakes up, no more branch. So this is a Banco do Brasil exploded in Bahia, right? This is a Bradesco branch. Again, municipality, you wake up, there is no more branch, right? So we collected this data on bank robberies by state police departments and internet searches. The other data sets are very standard. We're going to focus, again, we want this to be a big shock. So we're going to focus on small and medium-sized municipalities that have few branches, right? So then we lose a branch, okay, that's a local big shock to the availability of cash in that municipality, right? Again, we could do an event study, right? But then we go a step further and we do a match diff, but the shock is so large. I mean, everything a few papers that everything works, right? So but again, we're gonna show results for our result matched difference and difference, combination with an event study, right? Is the states that we collected data. We're gonna look at municipality level regressions to see what happens to peaks, and we're also gonna look at municipality bank month regressions. Again, we're gonna control for time fixed effects, municipality fixed effects, bank time fixed effects, and again to avoid alternative explanations. So as I said, so here is an event study, diff with around the events. There is no effect on homicides, for example, right? We are expanding to other types of crimes now, but this is just to show that okay, this event, this shock is not related to local trends in crime, right? And then here we are looking at the cash stored inside the branch. So once this event happens, this is inverse hyperbolic sign. So what this means that for a while, there is no more cash stored in that branch. So again, the municipality wakes up, there is no more cash to withdraw. There is no way to deposit cash in that branch, right? We look at this effect, it has some persistence, and then what we are arguing now is that the municipality is moving to a new equilibrium with smaller cash reliance, and I'm gonna show that now. And we also show that few branches close eventually. So what we're showing here is that it's a temporary shock that leads to persistent effects in financial technology adoption, digital payments. So here is the effect on this digital payment method, peaks, right? We see the number of the increase of transactions in that, this is at the municipality level. So peaks, the number of transactions increase, the value of transactions increase, right? here event studies. So think again, this is weekly data. So this is the number of users. So there's a shock. The number of users starts to increase once there is a more branch that locality. Again, there's no way to withdraw or deposit cash. So people move to digital technology. The thing is increases slowly, and interesting, it remains, right? It doesn't go back to the previous level. So this is again, it speaks to the fact that there is like coordination failures in payment technologies, and we have a more detailed discussion now in the paper about what this means about the factors that prevent financial technology adoption, right? As I mentioned, coordination failures, fixed cost of adoption, lack of trust, lack of information, etc. Yeah, I'm going to skip this discussion about like mechanisms behind the persistence of the results. So let me go to the. So here we're going to start looking at spillovers, right? So distant transactions were not likely to be carried out by cash in the first place, right? They are very costly to be carried out by cash. So what we're seeing here is that once people start using PIX to make like internal transactions, right, inter-municipal transactions, they learn about the technology and they start making transactions that are like long distance transactions, you know? And probably these transactions are not carried out by cash in the first place. It's very costly to carry out a long distance transaction by cash, right? So this is the first spillover. Now the more interesting thing, right? So once people start adopting technologies, right, payment technologies, right, as I said, now the digital banks have an edge. Again, you don't need cash. I mean, the disadvantage of a digital institution is that, okay, cash is costly, right? If you have an account in a digital institution, you have to pay to use the network of a traditional bank to access cash, right? But now that people are using digital technologies, payment institutions can penetrate in that market. So payment institutions are, by definition, they're not affected directly by that shock, right? They don't have a branch. So once the branch is destroyed and people start like adopting technology, they start using payment digital institutions, right? So that's something that we find very interesting, and you know, it connects to the importance of digital payments to foster competition in payment markets, right? Now, the other thing that we find interesting is that, okay, there is now you know that there is a lot of synergies between payments and credit, right? So not only these digital institutions start to increase their penetration in digital payments, they also start to grant more credit in that place, right? And again, there's like many mechanisms behind this complementarity between payments and credit. One of them, availability of hard information that allows banks to grant credit more efficiently, right? The question that we want to do, so these robberies happen before and after peaks. So does peaks explain these spillovers to digital institutions? In other words, let's think about a counterfactual world, right? Without peaks, right? Would fintechs expand with the same intensity in this counterfactual world without peaks, right? So that's a difficult question to answer, right? There's a huge confounder, which is the COVID, for example, right? The COVID led to a huge increase in digitalization. So what we're going to do here is a bit speculative, but we find very interesting. So you're going to look at the effects before and after peaks. So the question is, does peak explain at least part of these spillovers to digital institutions? Does peaks help the penetration of digital institutions in those markets? And what we find comparing coefficients is that coefficients are much larger post peaks. And this is a bit speculative, but it basically it's speaking to the importance of the availability of a cheaper, like appropriate digital method to foster competition, not only in payment markets, but in credit markets because of complementarities, right? And that's the conclusion. So that it's, you know, we provide evidence that the disruption in branch operation lead to induce temporary branch closures, right? Induce permanent increase in digital payment technologies, and we show that what we find is really important is that spillovers not only in payments but also in credit. And we are now, this is a bit more speculative, but we are thinking that peaks the availability of peaks is important to support these effects. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to invite the Sergei Sarkisian to present his discussion.
Thanks for inviting me to discuss this paper. So this interesting paper discusses banks' physical footprint and financial technology adoption. I have to say this is a long paper, so I will touch only upon main results, but I encourage everyone to read it, especially if you do research on PICs. I myself found it very interesting and useful for my own research. Okay, so big question this paper asks is how bank closures affect demand for payment technologies, for financial technologies. Because bank branches make us use cash. If you have a local branch around your home, you're likelier to use cash because cost of using cash are lower. You can deposit it back anytime, and you can withdraw it anytime. So it makes you want to use more cash. To answer this question, to identify the effect of branch closure on payment technologies, authors use robberies, hit and runs on bank branches, which they argue gives a plausibly exogenous variation in branch closures. And the payment technology they consider is PIX, which was introduced in November 2020 by Brazilian Central Bank. Of course, it's interesting to understand why people use PIX and try to nail down reasons of PIX usage, which hasn't been done in the literature before this paper. Okay, so first I want to say that paper does a lot of cool regressions, which I found convincing. So I will try to give a few comments that will help to further nail down the identification. So what we want to show is that branch closures lead to more PIX usage. Again, because if your branch is closed, it's costlier for you to withdraw cash or to deposit cash, and then you will want to use cashless technologies, in this case, PIX. And so variation in branch closures come from hit and runs on branches. In my opinion, authors make three identification assumptions. So first is parallel trends in treated and non-treated areas, absent robberies. This is why authors use matching in the paper. Now, there are two more assumptions. One is that, of course, robberies have to impact branch closures. So one implicit assumption, it's a relevance assumption, that when the robbery happens, the branch closes. And the third assumption, which I will mostly discuss in this discussion, is that robberies impact PIX usage only through branch closures. So this is exclusion restriction. So if we want to claim that branch closures lead to increase in PIX usage, this assumption is also necessary. Authors discuss assumptions 1 and 2 really well, so my comments will be mostly some additional robustness test on this. Assumption 3 might need a little bit more discussion in the paper, and I will suggest a few comments that authors can do to answer this. Okay, so first about parallel trends, and this is a general comment about the paper. Authors do a lot of complicated regressions, which like very advanced econometric methods like coarse matching. I find this really exciting and cool and convincing because this is state-of-the-art econometric literature. However, it would be nice to see standard methods too. To understand really why we need coarse matching, why standard propensity score matching doesn't work, or why standard OLS wouldn't work. So it would be nice just to see, here are standard results. We also do this advanced method. Ideally, they should be more or less similar. So it would be, I think it would be interesting to see both, especially for the audience that never seen coarse matching like myself. It would make it more intuitive. Now, I was interested why matching variables don't include crime rates. For example, before COVID pandemic, yes, authors tell that these crimes are unexpected, which I'm ready to believe. For example, they show that there is little correlation with homicides, which tell us, well, it's not necessarily very dangerous areas where these hit and runs happen. However, what about other robberies? So authors mentioned that there is no correlation with other robberies too, but it would be nice to see graphical evidence, or at least correlations in the paper to show that, for example, other robberies and hit and runs are not correlated, and that would help us understand more that this crime is more unexpected. But including crime rates in the matching in this scenario would not harm if there is no correlation. One table that I found interesting is this one. So this table from the paper shows that there is more or less nothing that predicts robberies. Well, this might tell us that robberies are unexpected, but I would also include f-stat in these regressions to make it even more convincing, because, for example, R-squares are low, and this table might tell us that robberies are unexpected. On the other hand, it might tell us that there are other variables that, for example, other robberies that might predict this. So just include f-stats, show this is significant, and I think this will be enough in the parallel trends. So overall, I believe parallel trends assumption. I think authors do a lot of work to show that trends are indeed parallel absent robberies. Now, I will go very quickly over relevant assumption because I think authors show it pretty well. Okay, I'll skip relevant assumption. Let me go to exclusion restriction. So I think currently this is what authors need more work to do. Robberies don't only lead to closure of branches and then increase in peaks. In my opinion, robberies also disincentivize me to carry cash. If I know that the hit and run happened here, I assume that the robberies increase. So I would want to use cashless technologies and not carry piles of cash with me. So if this is the case, exclusion restriction is likely not satisfied. And for example, authors see decline in TEGI usage. TEGI is also electronic technology, so it seems that I would want to use more TEGI and PICs if this happens. So decline in TEGI might mean that people just want to use PICs potentially for different reasons. And suggestions I have, authors restrict municipalities that have at most 10 branches. Try to look at others as well. It would be nice falsification test. If you see that in others, it doesn't matter. It likely doesn't mean that people just want to use PICs, and it's likely related to intensity of the shock. If you have zip code level analysis, that would help. Then you can look at large cities. You can look at zip codes inside São Paulo, for example. Okay, those are minor issues, which I'm happy to discuss later. I think this is very insightful paper. It addresses an important question, which we don't have answer to yet. It needs a little bit more work to sharpen identification, especially exclusion restriction. But I look forward to reading the next draft, and I encourage everyone to read the paper again, especially if you work on this area. I think the paper is very insightful and it provides many details on why people use PICs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone has any question, please? Oh, please.
No, so a similar point to the one raised in the discussion, no? So banks make us use more cash, or bank robberies are making everyone use less cash, and before PICS it was just hard to find a substitute, and now PICS is giving us that platform, no? So this goes into how should the mechanism behind and how are we interpreting this shock, right?
Yeah. More question? Oh, please.
A nice paper. I think along the lines of what the discussant said, have you considered distinguishing municipalities with more branches, fewer branches, more than one bank? Bank has one branch only. Customers move to the other bank that has still branches alive, and also ATM machines standalone ATM machines. In Brazil, in many small cities, you have not a branch, but you have a standalone ATM machines that are that allow customers to use all the banks in that standalone or just one or Banco do Brasil standalone ATM machine. So they are very much used in small cities. Also regarding whether you have considering examining spillover effects to municipalities in the vicinity of the municipality that suffer the robberies, because people hear the news and might think that there might, well, there's a gang around that might come back to this region and rob the municipalities in the nearby region. And finally, I understand that there are many, many of the robberies occur much before, in your sample, much before the PIX adoption, right? So I wonder whether this time that has elapsed since the robbery until the PIX adoption makes still the channel as relevant, because people might have forgotten about the robberies. The branch is already alive before the PIX adoption. So there's some more discussion about this, I think, would be interesting.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. Go on, please.
Try to. Standalone ATMs, there are not many in Brazil because of violence, security concerns. So many are inside branches in Brazil, especially in the countryside. So that's there's no like high street level ATMs as in Europe, as you can notice, right? If you're in the US or in Europe, you can see a high street ATM, but here there are no other crimes. So we're doing that effort now. The things that once you move out from homicides, other types of crimes, there is like issues of underreporting, classification, etc. So we might do for a subsample that we think the data is more reliable in terms of other crimes. But the main reason is that we focus on homicides is people in economics of crime, and they know that there is less underreporting, for example, right, of like cell phone robberies, etc. More branches, we did that test in place with more branches, and there is no results, and that's why we focus on place with small branches so that the shock is meaningful enough. But it's a good falsification test. I mean, we took it out because we did like it heterogeneates across the number of branches, and then the effects fade away, right, once you increase the number of branches. The thing about the timing of peaks, so we have like most of the robberies happen before peaks because this crime is decreasing, the number of this crime. But then the analysis that we do post peaks, we do event studies around the robberies. There are still robberies after peaks, the introduction of peaks, and then we do the event studies around the robberies. So you look at weeklies, weeks after, weeks before. So that's around robberies after peaks. And the question about Claudia is that I think that, it's very hard to pin down the mechanism, the importance of peaks, because there are many other trends going on in that period, but we do analysis pre and post peaks, and then trying to show that having peaks is an important underlying factor, right, for the results. But this part is a bit more speculative. It's because there are like digitalization trend, people are adopting other methods, and because of COVID, etc. So this part we are thinking a bit more of how to pin down like peaks, right? And in regard to exclusion restriction concerns, we are aware of that, and we're trying to address that thing, those alternative concerns about, for example, fear of carrying cash. One thing that we stress in the paper, and this happens really in the dead of night. So people will sleep and then they wake up. This is not like a daytime crime. It happens in like daylight, around noon. The explosion happens at 3 a.m. They flee like 20 minutes after. You wake up, the community is basically the same, but without the branch. So that's temporarily, right? We cannot measure how long the branch stays closed, but we see the cash levels stored inside the branch, and we see that they go down and then they increase slowly. I think maybe Sorry if I forgot.
Okay, no, thank you. Great. Now, the last paper from the Sergei Sarkisian. Hello. Instant payment system and competition for deposits.
Okay, again, thank you very much for inviting me here to present my future job market paper. So I study how instant payment systems impact competition for deposits. So in most developed countries and developing countries, such as in Brazil and in the United States, large banks control lion's share of deposit markets. Top 10 largest banks control around 90% of deposits in the US, and small banks control low share of deposits. However, at the same time, large banks pay very low interest rates on deposits. For saving deposits, it's very close to zero. For time deposits, around 2%. Small banks pay large interest rates. However, we don't see movements of depositors from large banks to small banks despite clear interest benefits. So one reason for this, of course, there are many reasons for this, but one important reason for this, which I will argue in this paper, is payment convenience. Large banks offer their depositors payment convenience, such as access to better online banking app, more ATMs, unlike small banks. Small banks don't. So depositors are ready to forego high interest paid by small banks to enjoy payment convenience offered by large banks. So in this paper, I try to show what happens to deposit market concentration when small banks offer payment convenience. To do this, I study how instant payment systems, so cashless systems that allow to make instant payments, how usually it works. You scan a QR code and money goes instantly from your bank account to recipient's bank account. These instant payment systems very often have low entry costs for all banks, not only large banks. So we may know that cashless apps like Venmo in the US are very expensive for small banks to enter. Many instant payment systems are cheap for small banks to enter. So effectively, they provide small banks with payment convenience. So the question I ask, how do instant payment systems impact competition for bank deposits? If they provide payment convenience to small banks, and payment convenience is important determinant of deposit market concentration, we should see changes in deposit market concentration. To answer this question, I use data on PIX, instant payment system developed by Central Bank of Brazil in November 2020. And for identification, I will use a variation from the easing of COVID-19 restrictions in Brazil. I do this and show that there is a persistent reduction in deposits of persistent increase in deposits of small banks relative to large banks. So specifically, I will show that for all types of deposits, checking, saving, and time, small banks gain deposits relative to large banks. I also see a persistent reduction in measures of deposit market concentration. So deposit markets in Brazil become more competitive. At the same time, I also look at interest rates, and I see that small banks reduce interest rates relative to large banks. It's not only reallocation from large banks to small banks, it's also increase in deposits overall, potentially because people who were using cash before opened deposit accounts, because now all deposits became more convenient. To further strengthen the results, I estimate the model of deposit demand in banks. So I show that there is an increase in demand for small bank deposits relative to large banks, even accounting for interest rates. Model allows me to study two counterfactuals. One counterfactual is, what if peaks were never introduced? So in the world without peaks, I show that Herfindahl-Hirschman index, my measure of deposit market concentration, would be larger by 3%. And finally, I show that if peaks were available only to large banks, like in most payment technologies, which are created by large banks or available to large banks would effectively take the markets to themselves. Herfindahl-Hirschman index would be larger by more than 100%. So deposit markets would be much more concentrated than they are currently in Brazil. Okay, so instant payment systems are being developed around the world now. Brazil is not the only example. For example, United States are going to introduce a system called FedNow in July. That's the date of launch. And as I said, most of these instant payment systems are cheap for small banks to enter, and many central banks even mention concentrated deposit markets as a reason for creation of these systems. So these systems give small banks payment convenience. So why I chose Brazil for my studies? So first, Brazil is a large economy. It's the third largest economy in the Americas. It's the largest economy in Latin America. And what I want to argue is that banking structure is fairly similar to the US. Deposit markets are concentrated. National Herfindahl-Hirschman index is around 0.2, like in the US. It effectively means 5 equal-sized large banks in the country. There is a strong community banking. Many banks, like in the US, and in municipalities, deposit markets are very concentrated. So you might have 1 or 2 banks that control the markets in each municipality. And there is a low but significant number of unbanked population, especially after the COVID, and the payment infrastructure is developed. I would say in Brazil it's more developed than in the US, but they're still fairly similar in terms of quality of online banking apps. So Pix was launched in November 2020. As the authors mentioned before, it's used by a large share of the population. It's offered by almost all intermediaries, including fintechs. It's free for bank households. It's cheap for banks and merchants. And it allows making payments, which also makes this a preferred way to make payments in Brazil, which this graph shows. So blue line is Pix. You can see that at some point it passed credit and debit cards in terms of transactions in Brazil. So it's more popular than credit and debit cards to make payments in Brazil currently. So my data comes mostly from the Central Bank of Brazil. I use municipality level monthly data on Pix transactions. Municipality in Brazil is analogous to county in the United States. I have branch level, or effectively municipality level, monthly data from ESDBAN on bank balance sheets. I have bank level personal loan rates from Central Bank. And then I also have demographic data and macro variables to include as control variables in all my regressions. There are 2 important definitions before I go to results. First, I define market concentration using Herfindahl-Hirschman index. Herfindahl-Hirschman index sums square deposit shares. So if this number is 1, it means you have a monopoly in the municipality, just 1 bank. If this number is close to 0, it means you have many equal-sized banks in the municipality. Second definition is large banks. So I try different measures. My benchmark measure is 2 Brazilian banks with the largest number of depositors, because deposits are what we're interested in. These 2 banks control 30% of all branches and 40% of assets. However, I do robustness tests where I include 4 large banks and results are similar. Okay, so first, I study how Pix impacts deposits of small banks. So I regress deposits on Pix, and when I say Pix, I mean value of Pix transactions in Brazilian reals. The dummy variable for large banks. So negative coefficients in regression means increase in deposits of small banks relative to large banks. Specifically, this number, 4.3, means that if value of Pix transactions increases by 1 standard deviation, which is in my sample 100%, so number of Pix transactions, value of Pix transactions doubles, time deposits of small banks will increase by 4.3% more than time deposits of large banks. Time deposits are deposits that pay you highest interest, so households move to time deposits of small banks because now both banks, small and large banks, provide you payment convenience. There are less reasons to stay with a large bank. And this graph you can see how Herfindahl-Hirschman index changes over the course of 5 months. So you can see that there are no pre-trends, and that increase in Pix usage leads to decrease in Herfindahl-Hirschman index, and this effect persists at least over 5 months. I checked longer, but my public sample, which I could access without having proprietary data, ends at 7 months. I still see strong effects after 7 months. And I also look at the asset side. So if large banks lose retail deposits relative to small banks, we should expect them to contract lending. That's not what we see. We see that traditional lending is not cut. So large banks still keep lending as before. However, they cut so-called financing, which is subsidized lending. So it's safer loans, which large banks cut to originate riskier loans. And how they do it, they increase alternative uninsured funding. This is related to the work by Tony White at Kairong Shou and Yifeng Wu, where they show that even if banks lose deposits, they can always substitute them with riskier wholesale funds. And that's what I see. If you add up this number to the number of loss in retail deposits, numbers will add up almost exactly. Okay, and finally, as I mentioned, I see a reduction in interest rates. In my case, I look at personal loan rates. Small banks sometimes have larger loan rates relative to large banks because they also have to have large deposit rates to attract customers. I see that these trends change. Loan rates of small banks decrease relative to large banks. Okay, so everything I showed so far has identification issue. As we were discussing in the previous paper, we don't know why in some municipalities there is more PIX transactions, in some less. So, for example, political beliefs might affect both PIX transactions and usage of deposits. So what I do, I use easing of COVID-19 restrictions by Brazilian municipalities, and there is a survey data by September 2020 for each municipalities. I know if COVID-19 restrictions were relaxed. And so assumption that I make will be that easing of COVID-19 restrictions impacts usage of PIX. So PIX was introduced in November and restrictions were eased in September, by September. And my data is monthly. So I do see increase in PIX usage in municipalities that eased COVID restrictions because without restrictions, you can spend more, you can travel, and people spend more and they use more PIX. At the same time, I assume that the only way easing of restrictions can impact deposit market concentration is through PIX. And justification is, well, if PIX impacts somehow deposit market concentration, so if COVID restrictions impact deposit market concentration themselves, it would happen when they're eased and not with a 2 or 3 month delay. My preferred specification is heteroscedasticity based because COVID-19 restrictions don't just increase spending, they increase variance of spending. However, standard IV also works, it's in the appendix of the paper. Okay, so this is the same graph as before. I do see the decline in deposit market concentration over the course of 5 months. So let me give you magnitude. So this number shows that if you have a municipality with 5 equally large banks, if in this municipality per capita PIX transactions increase by 1,000 reals, which is around $200, there will be 6 equal-sized banks, not 5. So that's from 5 banks you move to 6 banks. So markets become more competitive. And it's not only reallocation from large banks to small banks, it's also increase in deposits overall. So for all types of deposits, I see that municipalities with more PIX transactions, there is an increase in deposits and loans. So potentially households that did not use banks before started using banks more because now banks provide more payment convenience to these households. Okay, so the last thing I want to show in the paper, there are 2 unanswered questions so far. So first, how does PIX impact deposit demand, conditional interest rates? So far, I showed that deposits of small banks increase relative to large banks, but I haven't talked about demand effect. So I haven't shown that this is increase in deposit demand conditional on interest rates. Second thing I want to show is counterfactuals. What would happen if PIX were never introduced? What would happen if PIX were available only to large banks? So model estimation allows me to study these important counterfactuals. So in the model, I have households, mass WT, that choose to invest $1 that they have to 1 out of J banks in the economy. Banks face deposit demand and they choose their deposits and assets following constant leverage constraint. So all banks offer payment system starting from November 2020, as it was in reality. There are very few banks that did not join PIX so far. And I also split banks into large and small, same way as in the reduced form analysis based on the number of depositors. So each household gets utility. So household I gets utility from investing in Bank J because Bank J pays interest RJ. Bank also has locations, has branches in locations where people use PIX, which I call PJ. So if your bank has locations in municipality that offer where people use PIX more, you like it because PIX allows you to make faster payments. So you like if your bank has locations in places where people use PIX. I also interact PIX variable with the dummy for large bank. So I'm interested in delta in this parameter delta D. And finally, I include control variables. So those are non-interest rate characteristics that make me want to use the branch. And finally, I include bank fixed effects. So there are 2 identification concerns, standard in the literature. So first, interest rates are correlated with unobservable deposit demand. Of course, it's not only the case that higher interest makes you want to use the bank, it's also the case that your demand for deposits leads to changes in interest rates. So I follow the literature and I use supply shifters to identify the parameters. So I use fixed costs of running assets, for example, how much it costs to rent the building for the bank, and provision for loan losses as instruments for interest rates. So the idea is that these variables likely impact the decision of bank to change interest rates. But given that deposits in Brazil are mostly insured, this does not impact my decision to open the branch, to open the bank account at the branch. So this would be my identification assumption. People usually also add salaries here. Unfortunately, I don't have good data on salaries per branch to include it as an instrument. Second concern is that PIX is correlated with unobservable deposit demand. This is the same concern as we had before. In the reduced form, I use easing of COVID-19 restrictions as instruments in the first stage, and then I use this predicted PIX in the regression, in the analysis. And I cluster standard errors to make sure this error of predictability does not drive my results. So I estimate the model using GMM, and I find the following numbers. So first, I find that increase in deposit rates would lead to increase in deposit share. So 1 percentage point increase in deposit rates would lead to 80 basis points, 0.8% increase in deposit shares. So increase in deposit rates, as is shown in most of the demand estimation papers, leads to increase in demand for deposits. Now, conditional on that, this negative parameter here means that 1% increase in PIX transactions leads to 2.3% increase in demand for small bank deposits relative to large bank deposits. So deposit shares of small banks increase relative to large banks, and this is consistent with reduced form estimations. So the model allows me to study two counterfactuals. So the first counterfactual, what if PIX were never introduced? The red line is no PIX scenario. The blue line is the benchmark model estimation. So you can see that Herfindahl-Hirschman index would be larger if PIX were never introduced. So large banks would grow larger absent PIX introduction. And the final counterfactual, so most payment technologies that are being created are either created by large banks or they're offered only to large banks. For example, Swish in Sweden, Venmo and Zelle in the United States, and in Brazil there was a technology, and there is a technology, Boleto Bancário, which was not accessed by all banks in the country. And so I show that if this was the case with PIX, Herfindahl-Hirschman index would increase. So red line is no PIX, blue line is PIX only for large banks. So large banks effectively would offer the best payment technology in country, so they would take the deposit markets to themselves. So what I argue is that that was in terms of deposit market concentration, that was a correct decision to make PIX cheap enough for small banks to enter the market. So let me conclude. I show in the paper that instant payment systems can promote deposit market competition, and of course it has important implications for monetary policy. So monetary policy partly transmits through banks having market power, and if deposit markets become more competitive, it potentially means that transmission of monetary policy should intensify. It also has implications for access to credit, and I know that some people in the room do research on the provision for credit. It has implications for investments. I do see a rise in investments 1 year later in municipalities with more PIX transactions. However, it's hard to identify the effect since investment data is very scarce, but that's potential for future research. And finally, since we see that PIX in Brazil leads to increase in deposits and loans and a reduction in interest rates, there should be implications for welfare. Of course, the structural model allows to look at welfare, which I plan to do next, but maybe more advanced model of banks would be required to really look at the welfare and choice of payment methods. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, I invite Benjamin Tabak to discuss.
This is the discussion on Paper by survey, instant payment systems and conditions. Huh? For deposits. Okay. So the research question is, how do instant payment technologies impact financial intermediation? So he studied the Brazilian PIX at the study case, instant payments. His main finding is that positively impact deposit market competition. He finds increases in bank deposits, comparing small banks versus large banks, increase in lending, and lower loan rates. When we think about the peaks, we're thinking about a causal effect on deposits, and there are several potential confounders that we need to take care about. One is government support, because you have government support that were allocated in different regions of the country. We also have macroprudential policies, and they differed across large and small banks. So large banks operated many of these government credit support programs. So how to disentangle that? So this is an important question in order to revise the paper. The paper also calculates per capita and per user transactions for all municipalities. And I wonder whether you have some information segregated by individuals and non-financial firms on this data. In the paper you mentioned in table 3 that you provide statistics on banks separately for large and small banks for 2 months before the pitch launch and after. But I find a bit some concern with the definition of large banks. I mean, you rank bank branches and assign the number of total banks assets to each branch. And then a large bank, if you define the large bank if the asset exceeds the median. So I wonder why not use the definition provided by the central bank. You can find that definition on the website, because you use prudential segment that's highly correlation with the bank side. I find this definition quite troubling, actually. So when we look at the sample of large banks, you mentioned that you only include Banco do Brasil and Caixa. This is the 2 public banks. And this is also a bit of concern. Why are you missing the big 5? You also have Bradesco, Itaú, and Santander. And my question is, how does it affect the overall results? Since these are very important Brazilian banks. And I wonder which banks are entering the sample, because when you think about geographic location, and you think about small banks, the definition of small banks, I mean, small banks, they should not operate in all the cities, in all the municipalities, because they're small. I mean, if they're operating in all the cities, they should be treated as larger banks. So I wonder whether they are specific, these small banks are operating in specific locations, whether they're more specialized. This is interesting to look at. You also mentioned that you cite this paper too, and I suggest to check more of the recent literature as well. For example, the paper that we presented before, we showed that more digitalized banks are more cost flexible and are able to increase loan deposits. This one is more related to your work than the one that you just cited. When you look at the specification of equation 2, you have a contemporaneous relationship. In some cases, this could be seen as a bad control. And if you want to extract causality, we need to see exogenous variations, because changes in peaks can affect deposits and vice versa. And the variable in your regression is the peaks t, at time t. It is the volume or the number. So, and this is important because the specification does not have bank time fixed effects. In that case, you're not controlling for time varying bank-specific characteristics. Also, in table 4, it could be seen as a possible mechanical relationship, because you have more residents. It's reasonable to assume that deposit volume is likely to be higher. So one option would be to normalize the dependent and the independent variable, for example, divided by GDP or population, some sort of to deal with that. When you look at the coefficient in table 4, the intuition that for the same volume of peaks, the large bank suffers a decrease in deposit by 3% relative to small banks. Consider your definition of the bank side, which is very different from what we use to to employ. But this does not mean that deposits concentrate on small banks, because deposits could go to other banks in other cities. So, for example, how can you deal with digitalization, which is an important issue as you're dealing with branch level analysis? When you deposit in a digital bank, in which city the funds are allocated? So this is, it could be a limitation of the results. And then when you look at equation 3, where are the municipality fixed effects? Why not use the same variable capture on peaks across the specification? Because you change that in different specification. And also, if you have a lag-dependent variable, shouldn't you be using GMM estimation or something like that? And in the first, use the log of volume peaks or number of transactions, not very clear. And now you're using the peaks per capita. It would be interesting to see the same peaks variable to keep the notation consistent. We also read in the paper that the peaks lead to an increase in bank deposits, especially for smaller banks. I think you have to include that's in the same city. So if you want to check this claim, we could run a bank level regressions, maybe creating a bank level exposure variable as a weighted average of peaks adoption in cities that the banks operate. You also mentioned that, in simple words, easing COVID restriction can affect deposit and market power only through their impact on peaks. So you mentioned that the validity assumption is likely satisfied in the peaks dominate the retail payment market. Now, when you have more COVID-19 restriction, you also affect the economic activity, you affect deposits and the extent to which residents receive COVID-19 related support. So the question is whether this instrument passed the exclusion restriction. It could pass the relevance restriction, but not the exclusion restriction. You also mentioned that the exclusion restriction is also plausible since restrictions do not directly impact deposits and market power. But this may not be true, especially in small municipalities where financial literacy is low. And finally, in section 6.3, I tried to understand what was the reason for that discussion. It seems that it's for a different paper, because it's discussing central bank digital currency and it's in other countries. I couldn't match to the relevance of this discussion. I would take that section 6.3 away. Anyway, congratulations. It's a very hot topic because we are discussing this right now. It changed. It was a financial revolution in Brazil. It certainly deserves a lot of research. I think when I think about PIX, I think one of the main benefits is of financial inclusion. Now everyone can make payments and can receive money really, really fast. This was a very nice financial innovation from the central bank. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, if you have questions, please turn on the microphone.
Hey, Sergey, thanks for the presentation. I think I got as many comments as your discussant, so we should chat after. Are you working on like a simple cost model or something where you can redo the pricing counterfactuals? Because I think in terms of telling me about HHI, obviously as an IO person, I'm not super satisfied. I'd really like to see some changes in these prices that you can do in the counterfactual rather than just HHIs.
Thank you.
So we'll chat later.
Actually, I have two questions. So one, have you insisted a little, it looks to me like you stop at Esteban municipality level, but you do have branch effective level to play with, which would give that bank time fixed effects that Benjamin just suggested, and a lot of more room to convince your auditors about your results. Now, we can discuss this later, but I was wondering, where did you stop moving in that direction? And I can certainly say how difficult it is making PIX branches talk to the branches that we consider branches at Esteban. You don't have to tell me how difficult it is. But I mean, I would like to know later, why did you stop and not invest a little bit more in this direction? Although I do see why. But I'm very interested to know where do you stop there. And a second thing is I'm very triggered about your alternative funding that you show it over there, because it's hard to believe that any typical branch in any countryside city would be able to celebrate wholesale funding. I think what you see as alternative funding is a little bit, perhaps a little bit inaccurate definition, and perhaps you're not seeing what you think you see. What I think you see there is interdependency flow of funds. And it's very natural that cities with more savers will simply transfer funds within the branch network to municipalities in which you have more demand for loans but less savers. Perhaps this is what you're capturing there. I'm happy to go with you over Esteban accounting to check if what you see is what you have there, but I don't think you're capturing wholesale funding. Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, very last comment. I see the catch of going with the easing of COVID-19, but there is another side of the story. Very likely, during the beginning of COVID-19, there's some flight to quality going on. So these very big banks are likely to have received more deposits at the beginning of COVID-19. And then when you switch, and when you simply start relieving COVID-19, when this risk cools off, it is also likely that this money flows back to these smaller, unsafe banks. Because you don't really see those. I mean, the reasons that put you into flight to quality are no longer there. Okay. So perhaps this is not as cool silver bullet source of exogenous variation. But this is just food for thought. Outstanding paper. I really much enjoy it.
Thank you. Sergey, please. Oh, sorry.
Hi, it's a very interesting topic, and I have to. I'm going to add a little bit to what Benjamin mentioned about the small banks, and also the fact that right at the start you compare the Brazilian banking market to the United States banking market. I think you pushed a little too hard. We don't have small community banks that are very local. It's very, very different structure. And about the small banks, then what are these small banks, and are they actually payment institutions? Are they in or are they out? Especially when you consider the government transfers, and they could be to payment institutions. So it needs a little bit of clarification so that we understand what you're talking about.
Thank you. So, Sergey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for all comments, and thank you very much for the discussion. Okay, let me go over the comments one by one. So there were questions and the comment from discussion about potential confounders such as government support and digitalization and flight to safety. So let's consider that government support might confound my results. So government support would likely go through large banks. So if anything, that would bias my results towards zero. But also, my data is monthly. So since COVID restrictions were eased by September, I conditioned for October, and PIX was introduced in November. The only way government support or digitalization or flight to safety could impact results if easing of COVID restrictions has a delayed impact on deposits. So if you fly back to small banks, not right away, not in 1 month, but exactly in 2 months. Now we can think of stories how that could happen. Because each identification has flaws, but I think it's not very likely. Also, I do heteroscedasticity-based identification, so I don't assume that means of peaks and means of deposits change. I'm assuming that it's changes in variances. And also, I can see stories how deposit levels can change. Now, to discussant's point about government support, it's harder to think of stories how deposits would change differently for small and large banks, especially more for small banks than for large banks. Okay, now about definition of small and large bank. Thank you very much. I agree that I should check more how a central bank defines. So I tried as a robustness test to include top 5, top 4, top 3. My results are robust. Time deposits still increase more in small banks than large banks. I still see the same impact on interest rates and same impact on lending. Including COVID-19. The reason I included Banco do Brasil and Caixa in the main specification because they have larger numbers of depositors, had back then at least, and they're government banks, so they potentially provide more convenience. But I do see the point. I include the robustness test more variables. Okay, so I will check more recent literature. I think that's a great point. About fixed effects, so the reason I don't include, so I do include municipality time fixed effects in my regressions. In the appendix, I have tables without municipality time fixed effects. I include bank and time fixed effects. I can try to include bank times fixed effect in the regressions. So I can normalize the values to see what's happening. Now, about municipality fixed effects, I have a robustness test in the appendix where I include municipality fixed effects that does not change the main conclusions. About exclusion restriction, we talked. My assumption is that there is no delayed impact on Herfindahl-Hirschman index of the COVID-19 restrictions. So to violate my restriction, there should be that COVID-19 restrictions are eased, and then 2 months later, deposit markets become more concentrated, and not only mean of deposit market concentration, but also variance of deposit market concentration changes. And then, yes, I'm very happy to talk about the branch level SBAN. I did municipality level, so we can talk, and I would be happy to go over alternative funding results. The variables I used, we should just discuss what they actually mean, because in SBAN the description was very limited. I agree that probably inside the bank you have more information. So please, let's talk right after this. And then about banking structure that is different. I agree that, of course, it's not exactly the same in the US. By community banks, I mostly meant not what we actually in the literature mean by community banks, but banks that operate in their municipalities and not in anywhere else. What I would consider small banks in the most restrictive sample is anything beyond Bradesco, Banco do Brasil, Caixa, and Banco Itaú, and I also tried to include Santander. Other banks I would consider small. They could be less advanced in payments, but we do see still that people fly to them after introduction of PIX, and these banks picked up on PIX after its introduction. But thank you very much for comments. I'm happy to discuss afterwards.
Well, thank you for all. Thank the panelists for the brilliant session, for the audience, for the questions, and now the break time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.